I'm Lisa Mikkelsen, head of global human capital at Flourish Ventures. We back entrepreneurs whose innovations help people achieve financial health and prosperity. At Flourish, we're laser focused on the well-being of our founders. Well-being includes resilience, work-life harmony, and mental health. We're striving to normalize the conversation about mental health between investors and entrepreneurs. And since May is Mental Health Awareness Month here in the US, we felt it was the perfect time to feature a conversation about it with a founder. Today, I am thrilled to talk with Nektarios Liolios, a leading voice in FinTech, serial entrepreneur, mental health advocate, and all-around amazing human. Nektarios, thank you for being here today.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
So Nektarios, for our viewers who don't already know you, where do I begin? Swift, Startupbootcamp FinTech, Future Farm, Radish. You've had an incredible career journey building meaningful organizations. Can you just give us the elevator pitch of your career?
Well, it's interesting to hear all these labels for somebody who was a chubby gay teenager in suburban Stuttgart in Germany who wanted to be a breakdancer. I fell into financial services, pure coincidence. I then fell into innovation, and that changed my life after 17 years in the corporate world. I ended up building the first global fintech competition, which led to building the first global fintech accelerator program. And that led to me running away from everything, taking a break, and trying to do something a bit more meaningful, which means the Future Farm, which is one of the reasons we're here, which is an organization that advocates for mental health and entrepreneurship. And now I find myself at the tender age of 56 to be a fintech founder of an early stage startup.
Once again. Well, going back to those early days in your career, Nektarios, starting in the corporate world, how was it for you to make that leap, that transition from big corporate organization to scrappy, innovative startups?
I was lucky. Because I joined an innovation team within a corporate that had more freedom. So the transition was gradual. The choice to leave the big organization and do my own thing was more a necessity, and it was out of a frustration that I couldn't handle the politics in Swift, and I could no longer stand the fact that people were reluctant to do the right thing, and they were taking decisions out of political reasons or didn't take any decisions, which everybody in the corporate world knows. But then it took me about a couple of years until I actually was comfortable enough with the word entrepreneur. So that label didn't come easy because I was institutionalized for such a long time. It was an identity thing more than anything. We were doing cool stuff and I really enjoyed it, but being able to say, I'm a founder, I actually co-created this business and built something that employed people and did interesting things. It was a weird thing for a long time.
Well, you mentioned identity, and I think this is interesting because it's, in my experience with founders too, there is definitely this founder identity and this kind of neuro tribe that gets together and has some similar features. Tell us more about what that identity meant for you, and maybe why it was a little bit more difficult to fully step into that.
I think when you work in a large organization, you're usually just a wheel. And even if you have a position of influence, it's still not your business. So it's easy to go home at night and shut the door and then just start thinking about work the next morning. I think the easiest way to describe it is what happened when I left Startupbootcamp and Rainmaking, because that was me walking away from a thing that I built myself over 5 years. That ended up being a huge machine. We went from 10 people to 300 people. We had presence in about 12 countries around the world. So it was my life. And the line between my personal life and my professional life that existed before had just completely vanished. So the identity, this is where the identity piece comes in. The business is you and you are the business, and there's nothing in between. So I was grieving when I walked away from Startup Bootcamp because I really had to find who I was, because everything that I did the 5 years before that was absolutely merged, it was blended.
Wow. Okay. There's so many things there that I want to double click on, Nektarios. I mean, one is this notion of a blur between work and life, because you are the work. And I think in particular, as we've heard from the research and talking to founders, there's just a greater intensity as being a founder than working in corporate. And it is harder to maintain that life balance and well-being because there's so much sort of tangled up between you and the business. Share a little bit more about that, maybe in the context of Startup Bootcamp. And then also, I'd love to hear about what you might have been seeing at Startup Bootcamp, because on the one hand, you were kind of in both seats. You were the founder, that was your program, but you were also working with a lot of other founders.
I think the word that came to my mind when you started asking the question was authenticity. The only way you can succeed if you can be authentic as a founder, if you are representing yourself ultimately, because pretty much every founder worth a salt started this because they want to make a dent, they want to change something, be it people's lives or providing a solution to a problem. And it's really difficult to do this if you don't believe in it to the degree that this becomes you. I really believe that even now. And it's difficult to do this if you don't have that inner fire, that inner drive, and that makes it really difficult. I think in the corporate world, it's still relatively easy to, I mean, it's one thing to be the CEO of a big business and you go home and you still think about stuff at work, but it's still not your business to the degree that you need to have that level of authenticity. In Startup Bootcamp, I mean, it all started with InnoTribe beforehand, where we saw lots of companies that were trying to solve a problem in the financial industry. But in Startup Bootcamp, you get to spend more time with the founders, and an accelerator, an early stage accelerator, by its definition, attracts people who might be doing this for the first time, or people at the very beginning of their journey, who have thought a lot about a problem, about the technology, about the business model, about all the buzzwords that VCs expect them to use when they describe the business, and very often have no idea about what it means for themselves, about them as an individual, about them as a person. And they don't really think about the challenges that comes with it, transcend the business problems or the technology problems. So looking back at the time of Startup Bootcamp, and the reason ultimately we created the Future Farm was because both my co-founders and I have seen first-time founders, early-stage founders, getting into this out of a number of reasons, being attracted by the shiny lights of Silicon Valley and the big money and the success stories and the textbook entrepreneurs, in inverted commas, who are in the press, thinking that this is aspirational, whilst at the same time trying to solve a problem. And nobody talks about the fact that wherever there's light, there's also shade. And you watch and you observe people time and time again getting into all sorts of physical health problems, mental health problems, situations that they're not prepared for, not equipped for.
Wow, that's that must have been fascinating and also really hard to experience, seeing the other side, kind of the dark side of entrepreneurship. And you mentioned this is sort of one of the things that led to you starting the Future Farm and the work there. Tell folks listening a little bit more about the Future Farm, because I'm not sure everybody knows the Future Farm. And then what were some of the patterns, or what were some of the specific things that you wanted to address with the Future Farm?
Just to give a little bit more color on what we actually saw during Startup Bootcamp.
Yeah.
I felt I was battling on two different fronts. On the one side, there were the individuals who were visibly struggling, and I grew up in a home with a mother that had depression, but I also had therapy before my Startup Bootcamp life, so I had a bit of an awareness about mental health and what it meant for me. But first, being able to actually articulate that there's something going on that goes beyond the obviously visible or beyond the things that people talk about, which is all around the business, was tough. The second thing related to that was it was really difficult to talk to my peers about this, to people who were running accelerator programs and incubators and actually say, hey guys, can we do something as a community? Can we actually build something into our curricula to make sure that we at least talk about this? And there was very little response. People were either not interested or not equipped or not prepared to invest the time and the money and the effort that goes into just adding an element that says, hey guys, let's just talk about what is the softer things. And that was really frustrating. The other side of this, of course, were the investor community, who are also not necessarily prepared to have that conversation. So all this created an element of frustration where on the one side you have an awareness, but on the other side, you also know that you have very little support and very people to do this with. When I walked away from Startupbootcamp, I did this because of my own mental health. I walked away from it because I was physically burnt out, but also mentally just at the end of my tether, because I spent 5 years of my life just on a plane, working 16-hour days, having very bad sleep patterns, having very unhealthy habits when it comes to nutrition and no exercise, because the business was everything and I really wasn't looking after myself. So I thought I needed a break just to not kill myself. I thought that in that break, I will have the time to reflect and center and see if I can do something coming out of it that is looking to help entrepreneurs. And then the day after the last day of Startupbootcamp, literally the day after my leaving drinks, my dad died unexpectedly. So I was in this whole whirlwind of grieving my business, grieving my father, trying to figure out what to do next. I was 52 at the time, so it was a weird time in my life. But luckily, I met Vladi, who is now my co-founder and my co-host in the podcast, and we both were in a space where we wanted to do something that wanted to help entrepreneurs. So we started talking and we realized that we had shared experiences. I think it's important to also link this next step in my life to a very, very personal experience, knowing how difficult it is to pull yourself up, but also knowing how difficult it is when you're in it to actually acknowledge that it's actually happening. We've created a Future Farm for a number of reasons, but we didn't really have a business model. So we just wanted to talk more about what's happening in the entrepreneurial world from a mental health perspective. And we wanted to excite and invite people to share their stories. So the first thing we did was we created a podcast. It's called Naked by the Future Farm, where we invite entrepreneurs to come to us and be very vulnerable, be naked in that sense, that they drop everything and they share their story very candidly. And now we're on episode 70 something. So we had quite a few founder stories where people really open up. And the people who are prepared to do this are usually people who've been through the roller coaster and have come out of it and are happy to share their learnings. It's really difficult to invite somebody to talk about it when they're still in it. There's a very high level of depression, anxiety. There's people who struggle with so many different things, all the way through to suicidal ideation. And when you hear this from people who tell you on record that I went to bed wishing I wouldn't wake up the next morning because this way my kids would get life insurance money, it's something that you're not prepared to hear and nobody talks about. There's questions.
Can I
Go
just
ahead.
pause there? I just want to say thank you on so many levels. And I think on behalf of everybody watching and people who are watching and something is resonating here, the fact that you have started these conversations and 70 some podcasts of people who are willing to open up and share very openly and with vulnerability is just, in my mind, such a move in the right direction. And it's still so rare. And I just can't thank you enough and appreciate you enough for doing that. And I also want to ask you just to kind of build on this. You know, in the last few years, it seems like there's been this layering effect between the pandemic and the sort of macroeconomic situation and climate change and just global crises. I mean, there's so many things going on. And to your point earlier about when your father passed away, and you know, life is still happening, personal life is still happening. So we're grappling with just everything from the personal to on a global scale. what what are you noticing in your conversations with people about this accumulation of stress?
It's actually the first time. First of all, thank you for saying this. It's quite, I got a bit emotional when you said thank you, because we don't get to hear it very often. We don't expect to hear it, but it's just such a, you just steamroll it with your thank you. There are multiple ways or multiple things to say to your question. First one is, there's more people starting an entrepreneurial life than before ever, because it's easier. And from that perspective, there's more people who are likely to run into all sorts of experiences. In addition to this, there's the compound of what you just described. The pandemic really brought mental health to the attention of a wider audience, which I think was really important. I think it has to start, first of all, to talk about the fact, well, what does it actually mean with what is mental health and what are the things that I'm experiencing? Because one of the big problems is that people just think it's normal because it's part of the startup journey. So we had a session at a conference last October when we were talking about burnout. And one person in the audience raised their hand and said, guys, can I quickly interrupt? Because I don't even know what that means. And somebody gave them a textbook definition of burnout. And he just had this startled look on his face and said, well, then I've been experiencing burnout for the last 3 years. But there was no awareness that this is actually not normal. It doesn't have to be like this. Things like co-founder conflict, the isolation you feel, the loneliness you feel that we hear a lot from founders, the fact that the pressure just compounds the moment external investment comes in. So there's so many different things that just come together. And then you have the external things. Then you have the global political landscape, and then you have the economical crisis, and you have Silicon Valley Bank not being able to pay out the money that you raised the day before. And it's a lot. It's a lot. The key thing is, and one of the things we try to instill in people is, the only way you can learn to manage this is by building a mechanism that allows you to just acknowledge what's happening. And even that acknowledgement is something that people are not used to. So it requires an element of self-reflection and checking yourself. And once you do that, realizing that you need to do something about it. It's a long, long journey. That's why these conversations are so important. An additional element of what you said, because it was so packed, was also that there's practically no research on the subject. When we started this nearly 3.5 years ago, there was one study that was a global study on mental health and entrepreneurship, which is the one that everybody keeps referring to, by Dr. Michael Friedman from the Bay Area. And guess what? It's 2023, and there's still not more academic research to show how does mental health affect entrepreneurs differently from the general population.
It is really striking to me that this isn't something that more people are talking about. I mean, I know that, recently the World Health Organization had published a 300-page article or research on mental health, talking about kind of this worldwide transformation, and that this is a global crisis on its own. That doesn't even go into the specifics of the life of an entrepreneur and how much more stress is piled on top of that. Why are we still having such a hard time talking about this when it's so ubiquitous?
A lot of it boils down to patriarchy. And I'm saying this quite deliberately. It's the majority of entrepreneurs are male. The majority of tech entrepreneurs are male. And that's the people I mainly deal with. Masculinity within the context of patriarchy doesn't give you a lot of permission to acknowledge weakness, to acknowledge that you're struggling, to allow you to show vulnerability and actually say, I'm struggling with this. It's okay to go for a skiing trip and come back with a broken leg and everybody will say, hey, legend, because you did some stupid stunt. But at the same time, coming back from a retreat where you had to do some introspection and you realize that actually you need to look after your mental and emotional and psychological well-being is weak. So part of it is systemic. And part of it is because of that, there's a taboo, there's a stigma around acknowledging that this is a struggle that is as valid as any other physical challenge. It's a system that also feeds into each other. The glorification of success stories usually is built around people who, of course, would also publicly not talk about their emotional challenges. And in addition to this, there's also a glorification of the investment community of founders who just deliver, because the moment they show that they're struggling with something, the majority of investors will see this as a weakness rather than acknowledging that here's a CEO of a startup who actually had the guts to kind of speak up and say, hey, I really want this business to succeed, but I need to take some time off, or I need some support, I need some help because I can't cope. And all this feeding into each other isn't really helping the narrative, is it?
There is so much to unpack with what you just said, Nektarios. Thank you for talking about something that is pretty taboo. And I could just dissect your comment there for a whole nother conversation. But one thing that you mentioned that I want to talk about a little bit more is you talked about, okay, it's okay to have a broken leg, right? As I think about mental health, as we know about mental health, it's more like a not necessarily lifelong issue or set of issues that individuals are dealing with, but it's certainly something that is ongoing. That's not just like, oh, okay, I take this pill and magically I'm better, or my bones heal and I get stitched up and it's all good. There's clearly an ongoing nature to mental illness that requires work, support, finding new interventions. I mean, how do we as investors, as entrepreneurs, supporting each other, lifting each other up, stay positive, open, and curious about this topic, and just kind of keep the conversation going?
The thing that stayed with me when Michael Friedman talked to us on our podcast was, we asked him at the end, what is the one thing you want to leave with people to think about as we wrap up? And he said, I would ask everybody who deals with entrepreneurs, do you care about entrepreneurs as people? And that thing sent goosebumps down my spine. And it's still something that touches me really deeply, because reality is everybody who deals with entrepreneurs in our community looks at them as a commodity. Entrepreneurs are the ones who will make the VC rich. Entrepreneurs are the ones who will be the cool employer that somebody can join a company and be part of something successful and impactful, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, these are people who have their own challenges, their own journey. And when you take a moment to acknowledge that, then you can start also looking at what are the things that make them tick, and what are the things that can actually lead to their success, and where do they need support. And maybe we should start looking at all the different elements that contribute to this, rather than the textbook elements that you can buy books about that tell you how to build a successful business. So part of it is just learn about that stuff. It's not blah, it's real. Everybody has it. And entrepreneurs have it a little bit more. And guess what? Social impact entrepreneurs have it a little bit more even on top of that, because when their business fails, it's not just the business that fails, also they feel that they've let society down or the world down.
Well, Nektarios, I think back to your comment on knowledge originally and how important that is. I think to your point, the shock of not having more research on this subject doesn't lend itself to much empirical evidence, right? So I think having more of this research, having more knowledge available to say, look, this is, this isn't us just saying, oh, let's take care of people and because it's the right thing to do. This is real. This is actually something that we have a responsibility to pay attention to as investors who care about people that we invest in and believe in them, and also want them to be successful, right? So even if you're just purely looking at successful outcomes, wouldn't you do everything in your power to ensure success, including tapping into the well-being? And then I want to come back to that in a minute as we talk about really specific ways that we could be supporting our founders from a founder perspective, as well as entrepreneurs taking care of themselves. But first, I just want to ask you, given, Nektarios, you're very self-aware and incredibly reflective, and you've spent a lot of time thinking about this topic of mental health, both personally and through the work that you're doing. When you think about the work of the entrepreneur, the founder, this is ongoing, right? What is the work? What do individuals need to think about?
So when we started Naked, we had the founder stories. And then we realized maybe it's interesting if Vladi and I have a separate episode following on the guest episode to reflect on what we've learned, what we've observed by talking to the guest. And then we found out that more people are sometimes tuning in to listen to our conversation than to the founder conversation. And that's because when we talk to each other, we actually share our own journey as well. So it becomes a mutual therapy session. And the reason I'm saying this is for me, this has now become part of the work. But if we take a step back, the work means a bunch of different things. It all starts with self-awareness. So what does self-awareness mean? It's developing a discipline and a practice that allows you to figure out how you feel and be generous enough with yourself to acknowledge if something just doesn't feel off, and then figuring out if you should do something about it and what it is. And it's not straightforward, and it's different for every individual, and it's different for situations even within an individual. But this self-awareness is really important. And every single person we've spoken to, when we ask them about advice, that's where it starts. You need to find a way that works for you, where you do a little scan in the same way that you would test for a lump in your body to test for the figurative lump in your mental health. Because then you know, okay, something's up. I need to get some advice. Then the second thing we've learned is that a lot of people are overwhelmed by not knowing what to do next. And being entrepreneurs, they usually want to boil the ocean. But the key thing is small steps. So it doesn't have to be much. It could be just making sure you go for a 10-minute walk every day just to give yourself some time to breathe. It could be, in my case, what helped me really was journaling. And I had a paranoia, I had a fear about journaling, which was completely irrational. But once I gave it a try, I realized this was really helpful for me. So again, everybody's different and everybody needs something else. Often physical exercise is a good first step, or physical activities that allow you to take a moment to center. And the third thing, and this is something that every single person has also acknowledged in our experience, was conversations. Talk to somebody. It's not always easy, and it's not always easy to find the right person to talk to, but keeping it to yourself is not helping anybody. And people who have been encouraged to talk to somebody by their peers, by their partners, by their spouses, have found that this was a good way to start opening up and start letting this thing out that's been burdening them or festering. And it's fascinating. I mean, peer conversations are amazing, but sometimes it's just talking to your spouse, and guess what? Maybe they are prepared to listen. Maybe they care more than you think about. It's things like going on a retreat. It's things like taking some time off, not to do some other high intensity activity, which is what lots of entrepreneurs do, but actually genuinely going somewhere where you're being encouraged or even provoked to dig deeper than you would be normally prepared. But we call them the 3 S's. It's self-awareness, it's small steps, and it's sharing. It's easy to remember. But this is across the board the things that we would see as the beginning of the work.
Okay, great nuggets of wisdom there. 3 steps: self-awareness, sharing, and small steps. Those are all excellent ideas. And I'm sure there are some people watching who say, oh, that's all fine and well, but how do I get the time away if my investor doesn't think that is kind of questioning me because I'm taking time off, or X, Y, and Z reason that kind of gets in the way. What, on the flip side of the table, what are the things that we can be doing to encourage that as investors? And I know you mentioned one thing earlier, which was caring about people. I mean, as simple as it sounds, empathy and compassion, those are probably more difficult than we realize at face value, because while they're very much human, inborn, intrinsic skills that we have, they're also something that need to be cultivated and built. And from your perspective of working with investors, what are ways that we can be more helpful and encouraging and uplifting and supportive of you taking time that you need to do what's going to refill your bucket?
I wish there was an easy answer to this, Lisa. I mean, Flourish stands out, and I'm not saying this because I'm your guest, but it's really in the work that we did to try and find investors who are even open to having a conversation. There's only been a handful of kind of VCs, particularly, that we found, and this comes from people who worked in the industry and have a huge network. It was really shocking when we started this at the beginning of 2020. How many organizations told us we actually don't care. Because it's a portfolio game, and what startup fails because one of the founders has burned out, then it's just part of the game. And it's really shocking to hear that. People, of course, would not say it on record, but that's reality. I think the pandemic has changed it a little bit because people saw their companies struggling across the board. And it was really interesting also to see how investors really came together to support their portfolio companies with the Silicon Valley Bank crisis. But it all starts with awareness. It all starts with knowing that this is part of the individual's journey. There's a generational change. I think more young VCs are more aware because they've grown up in an environment where it was less taboo to talk about mental health. And there is also a growing number of companies, of startups, who make this an important conversation in the investment exchange, because it's not a one-way street. Often, if you're a good business, you have a choice of investors, and you're not going to take the ones that are so rigid in their ways that they don't care to respect that. But it becomes a differentiating factor. And interestingly enough, we've seen a few of the VCs we talked to that see this genuinely as an attribute that they can use to be more attractive to a founder. And this is something that investors should also know. The subject of education is something we felt is a good first step. So we created a curriculum within the Future Farm that we want to launch, which is all about bringing the whole organization on the same level when it comes to knowledge, just having an awareness. And then it's also down to the organization, because some investors are quite hands-off overall, and some, especially platform VCs, who have all sorts of support mechanisms for the founders, start looking if they should also introduce an element that looks at this side of the entrepreneurial facet rather than just the business support. You know what? Even to your question about what can investors do, it all starts with self-awareness. You need to figure out what kind of company you are, and you probably have some sort of values and mission statements, etc. But the question is how much really of this is built to reflect the needs, all the needs of an entrepreneur. And the chances are some of them are not. Maybe it's time to change that.
It's really powerful stuff. I mean, I'm just hearing that there's a few different things we should be thinking about. And a big part of that is just looking in the mirror and reflecting on who we are and what we stand for and communicating that. And it is a two-way street. It's also about, listening to what's the expectation. It's funny, as you were talking about entrepreneurs and having a choice between funders, I was just thinking about that, how as times have changed, a year and a half ago, it was very competitive, right? And venture firms were doing everything possible to try to woo amazing founders into their portfolio. And then fast forward to today, times have really changed. So there's always going to be some of these ups and downs. But to the extent that we can be consistent with our approach and thoughtful and sharing knowledge, it seems like regardless of what's happening in the world or in the state of investing, there's a lot we can be doing to be supportive. Nektarios, I'm again really grateful that you would take the time and join us today and share your experiences, share your wisdom. I really have greatly appreciated your friendship now over the years, and look forward to seeing what the Future Farm comes out with next and who's featured on your podcast next. So thanks again so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for allowing this conversation to happen. And thank you for showing up and asking questions about your role as an investor as well. It means a lot to me and it means a lot to us.
So thanks everyone for joining us today on another Flourish Conversation. If you have any questions regarding today's discussion, please email us at events@flourishventures.com. We'd love to hear from you if there's other things we should be talking about. See you next time.